Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'm coming to you from London today, and we're gonna travel locally. We're gonna head on over to Regent's Park, which is arguably my favorite place in London. I just love this park. And as luck would have it, the Frieze art sculptures are back. This is something I look forward to every year. They're actually part of the Frieze Art Festival, which happens in October, and this is a ticketed event, but the sculptures in the park are completely free for anyone to go and enjoy. You find them in the Avenue Gardens, and they are on display from the 14th of September all the way through the 13th of November 2022. So why don't we go check it out and see what they're all about? There's 19 large-scale sculptures this year, and I can't wait to see them, learn more about the art, and tell you which ones are my favorites. So off we go. I made my way through Regent's Park to the Frieze art sculptures. The closest underground station would be the Regent's Park station, but you could also very easily get there from the Baker Street station as well. And the area by the sculptures, which is called the Avenue Gardens, is just gorgeous. And even if the sculptures aren't there, I would really recommend going to check out both the Avenue Gardens and the Queen Mary's Rose Garden, which is also just stunning. Now, the first sculptures that I saw were actually not really what I would deem to be a sculpture, and more like a sign. And there's a series of them in the 2022 Frieze art sculpture bunch, and they are by John Wood and Paul Harrison. And the description of them is a bit like the signs you see in a park, a bit not like the signs you see in the park. So some of them are quite literal. Some are actually pointing to specific things, but it was really interesting to travel around and see all of the different ones. So the first set of sculptures that I stumbled upon are by Matthew Derbyshire. They're called Hercules meets Galatea, and they're actually meant to be viewed together, even though they are kind of two separate sculptures perched nearby one another. And what's really interesting about this one is the figure of Galatea, who's a sea nymph, is supposed to be cast as she's very smooth, she's very nonchalant, and she's supposed to be invoking confidence, whereas Hercules is quite rippled in his texture. I guess they took like a butter knife to some of the sculpture works before casting it in bronze, and he's a bit kind of hunched over, which suggests a bit of insecurity on his end, which is really unlike what you think of the character of Hercules. And it's really interesting to see kind of the dynamic between the two of them. And that's what you're supposed to be kind of questioning around things like substance, structure, surface, sexuality. Say that 4 times, 5 times fast. Next up, I couldn't help but notice this dramatic blue and yellow sculpture, and it's by an artist called Ugo Rondinanti. I hope I'm saying that right. And it's part of a series from Nuns and Monks, and this one specifically is called Yellow Blue Monk. And what it's supposed to symbolize is a contemporary version of the sublime, and it's supposed to have a mix of vulnerability and strength, and it wants the viewer to think about the solidarities and resonances between nature and the human condition. Next up, I went to view a sculpture from Robert, Indiana, which is called Imperial Love. I actually think I've seen some of his works before in the US, specifically in New York City. And with this one, it's actually a mirror, so you can see the word love created in a few different ways, which is rather cool. Indiana is a self-proclaimed painter of signs. He converts text into sculptures, and he refers to them as one-word love poems. How romantic is that? The next sculpture that I went to see is rather ornate, and it's one by Peju Alatage, and it's called Sim and the Yellow Glass Birds. Now, this is a Nigerian artist who has done quite a bit of work showing art, creating art that represents marginalized girls, and that's what this art depicts. It is the story of Sim, a 9-year-old girl who lives in 2 worlds. In one world, she is a domestic servant in Lagos. In the other world, Sim lives in a dreamland with talking birds and butterflies where she can fly. I love her dream world, and I think that's really important that the artist is depicting these types of narratives and storylines with her art. After, I went to explore a series of ceramic sundials by artist Emma Hart, which are called Big Time. Now, what's really interesting about these is these sculptures are meant to work outside. Each sundial is reinvented with faces, and they wait for exposure. And what's interesting about each dial is it's under a different time pressure. And what this means is it either takes way too much time or it doesn't have enough time, which kind of sounds like a metaphor for my life, which I'm pretty sure the artist was getting at that. Not specific to me, but I think all of us have felt like that in one way or another. Next up, I went to see a beautiful chased bronze cast by Norwegian artist Ida Ekbad. And what's interesting about this one is it's actually called the Book of Boredom. What a name for a sculpture that feels anything but boring. But what this sculpture is supposed to symbolize is it conveys a rich sense of abundance. This painted bronze sculpture presents a vibrant composition filled with fragmented, angular patterns and shapes from the artist's own expressive paintings. Again, perhaps this is where my understanding of art falls a bit short, but I don't think this sculpture has anything to do with being boring. Next up, I went to see Beverly Pepper's Curve in Curve. And what's really interesting about Pepper is she actually plays around with the elements of kind of the sculpture, seeing different types of colors in the rust, which is actually quite cool. And she played a lot with curvature in her sculptures. Next up, I went to see Pablo Reynoso's Speaker's Corner, and there are 5 different sculptures here, each of which looks like the base of a chair, but then has these amazing flutters that go up into the sky. And the idea is that Reynoso plays around with the heaviness of steel, but also tries to make it feel kind of light and effortless with the way he's designed this one. And the whole idea behind this is that the steel takes on a new life, defying the limits of what we think is possible. Next up, I went to see Roe Robertson's Drench, which is a really interesting assortment of sculptures, which is exploring the terrain of the queer body. And what these are supposed to symbolize is the tidal zone, which is an area of the coastline that becomes submerged at high tide and exposed at low tide. And the idea is this set of sculptures is an expanded reading of the body free from binary and rigid understanding. After, I noticed this gorgeous sculpture which looks like a big gigantic stack of red pillows, but this is actually appropriately called Red Stack, and it's by Sheikha Al-Mizro, and this is exactly what the artist aims to do. Her practice is to have an irreverent use of material and its apparent contradictions. So she takes these very durable, hard materials and she transforms them to look like something soft, pliable, or ephemeral, which is really not. Obviously, if you were to touch the sculpture, it's hard material, but it's meant to convey this kind of ephemeral softness, which is really interesting. Next up, I went to see this crooked looking ladder and wanted to know the backstory. It's by N.S. Harsha, and it's called Desired For-Arrived At. It is a bronze sculpture, and it's meant to symbolize the visceral movements of desire in our ever-changing positions of life. So symbolizing the fact that life isn't necessarily straight up and down, but is crooked and could have many different paths based on our whims and things happening in our life. Next up, I went to get a closer look at the sculpture by Tim Etchells, which is appropriately called Don't Look Back. It's actually meant to be displayed in reverse, so I'm actually showing it to you not quite in the right order. But what's really interesting about this is it's supposed to evoke and be a bit provocative about a post-Brexit, post-pandemic life. Don't look back. I'll let you read into that what you will. I really loved the next piece by Alicia Kłade, who is a Polish artist, and this really stopped me in my tracks because there's so many different layers to it and you really want to walk completely around it to fully appreciate it. This one is called Tunnel Tell, and it's supposed to question and challenge our limited view of what we call reality, which in the artist's opinion is as porous as it is opaque. And this is a symbolism for a lot of the artist's work. She's always kind of questioning our reality. You know, how are we kind of informing our reality? Are we stuck in our ways? Are we open to being challenged? Are we open to forging new paths? And I think that's a really nice symbolic piece of work, something we should all be thinking about more in our daily lives. Next up, I went to see a piece by John Giorno, which is called Space Mirrors Mine. Now, Giorno's no longer with us. He was a very famously influential poet and performer and visual artist, and in this series of kind of rock poems that he's done, he has a very simple 3-word poem which says Space Mirrors Mind. Next up, I went to see what I thought looked like a loo, but it's actually not. It's a bum print, and it's by Ron Erard, and apparently there was a sculpture called The Thinker which left, and leaving the bronze volume of what he was sitting on, which is an imprint of bum and feet, not so far off. And it's on display here is a prototype, apparently one of 6 of them, so the more you know. Next up, I wandered over toward Jordy Kerwick's fantastical sculpture, which is called Vertical Plane Me, which is really wonderful and magical, and apparently this is what is meant to be. The artist transports you into his dream world of mythology, folklore, and misadventure, and it's supposed to feel like a reinterpretation of his 10-year-old self's hopes, dreams, and fears. Next up, I made my way over to George Ricky's 5 Lines in Parallel Planes. And what this is supposed to conjure are tree branches gently rustling in the wind, yet the 5 armatures never touch. And apparently this is supposed to evoke an elegance, and apparently this is the first time this artist has ever exhibited outside of the United States. Thank you so much for tuning in to this video. If you liked this video, please hit that like button. Have you ever been to the Frieze Art Festival or gone to see the Frieze sculptures as part of Frieze in Regent's Park? If so, leave a comment down below. Sharing is caring here on this channel. If you want to see more great content like this, please hit that subscribe button. And if you are looking to check out the Frieze London Festival, the official ticketed event is happening from October 11th to 15th in 2023, and you can assume the sculptures in Regent's Park will be up a little bit beforehand. So definitely something to mark on your calendar for this year, just so you don't miss it. So thanks again for tuning in, and I will see you soon.